193 AD, something happened that should have been impossible. The Roman Empire, the greatest superpower in human history, was sold. Not conquered by barbarians, not inherited by a prince, not seized by a general. Sold at auction for cash. How do you even sell an empire? Who has enough money to buy 50 million people and half the known world? And what kind of person thinks they can purchase the loyalty of the Roman legions with gold instead of earning it through victory on the battlefield? The answer is a senator named Didius Julianus, a man who made one catastrophically stupid decision that would cost him his life, trigger a continent-wide civil war, and begin the slow-motion collapse of the Roman Empire. Because it turns out, when you can buy the throne instead of fighting for it, everyone starts to wonder, what else can be bought? And if the most sacred office in the world has a price tag, what happens to the empire itself? This is the story of how greed almost destroyed Western civilization, and how one man learned the hard way that some things in life cannot be purchased. To understand how the Roman Empire ended up for sale, we need to go back to the beginning of 193 AD and meet the man who almost saved Rome from itself. His name was Pertinax, and he was everything a Roman emperor should be: disciplined, honorable, incorruptible. But he had one fatal flaw. He trusted the men whose job it was to protect him. Pertinax came from nothing. His father was a freed slave who sold wood for a living. But through sheer determination and military skill, Pertinax had risen through the ranks to become one of Rome's most respected generals. He'd fought barbarians on the frontier. He'd governed provinces across the empire. He'd earned every promotion through merit, not money. On January 1st, 193 AD, he became Emperor of Rome. The empire he inherited was a disaster. The previous emperor, Commodus, had been completely insane. He thought he was a gladiator. He renamed Rome after himself. He declared war on the Senate. He bankrupted the treasury, throwing lavish games where he personally fought wild animals in the arena. Commodus had turned the greatest empire in history into his personal playground. But Commodus was dead now, assassinated by his own advisors who couldn't take it anymore. And suddenly, Pertinax found himself responsible for fixing 12 years of madness. The treasury was empty. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, had grown fat and lazy under Commodus. They expected massive bonuses just for doing their jobs. They'd forgotten they were soldiers. They acted like spoiled children with swords. Pertinax knew what needed to be done. He started selling off Commodus's ridiculous possessions: golden chariots, exotic animals, gladiator weapons. He used the money to pay the empire's debts. He reformed the currency, increasing the silver content to restore confidence. He cut wasteful spending. He tried to restore discipline to the military. In short, Pertinax was doing everything right, which is exactly what made him so dangerous to the Praetorian Guard. You see, these guards had gotten used to a certain lifestyle under Commodus. They were paid twice as much as regular soldiers. They lived in luxury. They had no real duties except standing around the palace looking intimidating. Pertinax's reforms threatened all of that. The guards began to grumble. They'd been promised bonuses that Pertinax couldn't afford to pay. They resented his attempts to make them actually work. They missed the old days when the emperor was a drunk madman who let them do whatever they wanted. Pertinax had been emperor for exactly 86 days when the tension finally boiled over, but he still believed he could reason with them. He still thought that duty and honor meant something to these men. He was wrong, because on March 28th, 193 AD, Pertinax would learn that some men cannot be reasoned with. They can only be feared. And unfortunately for the empire, the only men who truly feared Pertinax were his enemies. March 28th, 193. AD started like any other day in the Roman palace. It would end with the most shameful act in Roman history. The trouble began with a conspiracy. A Praetorian Guard named Quintus Sosius Falco had been caught plotting against Pertinax's life. But instead of executing him, which any other emperor would have done, Pertinax showed mercy. He pardoned Falco and let him go. This kindness was seen as weakness, and in ancient Rome, weakness was deadly. The Praetorian prefect Latus, the man who commanded all the guards, began spreading lies. He told his soldiers that Pertinax was planning to have them all executed. He said the emperor couldn't be trusted. He claimed they were all in mortal danger. None of this was true, but frightened men with swords don't always think clearly. By mid-afternoon, around 300 Praetorian Guards were marching through the streets of Rome. They'd left their barracks armed and angry. Their destination, the imperial palace. Their mission, to confront the emperor who they believed was planning to kill them. The palace guards saw them coming. They could have fought. They could have defended their emperor. Instead, they opened the gates and let the armed mob walk right in. Pertinax was in his study when word reached him. His advisors begged him to flee. There was still time to escape. He could rally loyal troops from outside the city. He could fight back. But Pertinax refused to run. He was the Emperor of Rome. He would not hide from his own soldiers like a common criminal. So he walked out to meet them. Picture the scene. 300 armed guards, their faces twisted with rage and fear, standing in the courtyard of the imperial palace. And facing them, alone, stood a 67-year-old man in a toga. No weapons, no armor. Just the authority of his office and the force of his character. For a moment, it worked. Pertinax began to speak. His voice was calm, reasonable. He explained that he had no intention of harming them. He reminded them of their oath of loyalty. He appealed to their sense of honor. Some of the guards began to waver. They lowered their weapons. They remembered who they were supposed to be protecting. But then one soldier, we don't know his name, stepped forward. "The soldiers have sent you this sword," he shouted, and he plunged his blade into the emperor's chest. The spell was broken. Other guards joined in. Pertinax fell to the marble floor, his blood pooling beneath him. The son of a freed slave who had risen to rule the world was dead. But the guards weren't done. They cut off his head. They mounted it on a spear. They paraded it through the streets of Rome like a trophy. The crowd was horrified. Pertinax had been popular with the people. He'd been trying to fix the empire's problems, and now he was dead, murdered by the very men sworn to protect him. But what happened next was even more shocking than regicide, because as the Praetorian Guards stood there, covered in their emperor's blood, they realized they had a problem. They'd killed the ruler of the Roman Empire, but they hadn't chosen a replacement. The Senate was too weak to pick a new emperor. The army was scattered across distant frontiers. Rome had no clear chain of succession. The throne was vacant. And that's when someone, probably Latus himself, came up with an idea that would echo through history as one of the most shameful moments in human civilization. They would sell the position, like a piece of furniture at market. Like a slave on an auction block, they would literally put the Roman Empire up for sale to whoever could pay them the most money. Cassius Dio, a senator who witnessed these events, was so disgusted he could barely write about it. Just as if it had been in some market or auction room, he recorded, both the city and its entire empire were auctioned off. In that moment, these soldiers didn't just kill an emperor. They broke the sacred bond between ruler and ruled. They turned the greatest office in the world into a commodity. They reduced the heir of Caesar and Augustus to the level of livestock. And Rome would never recover. Now came the impossible question. How do you put a price tag on absolute power? The Praetorian Guards had thought this through. they positioned heralds on the walls of their camp to announce that the position of emperor was for sale. Word spread quickly through Rome. Within hours, two serious bidders had emerged. The first was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus. He was Pertinax's father-in-law, the dead emperor's own family. Sulpicianus was already inside the Praetorian camp, supposedly there to calm the troops down after the assassination. Instead, he saw an opportunity. The second bidder was arriving from outside the city, Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, a former consul, a man who'd spent his entire career accumulating money and political connections. And now he planned to use both to buy himself a throne. But Julianus had a problem. The guards wouldn't let him into their camp. So he stood outside the walls, shouting his bids like a merchant at a market stall. Picture this absurd scene. The fate of 50 million people being decided by two old men yelling numbers at soldiers. The most powerful empire in human history being sold to the highest bidder. Sulpicianus opened the bidding. 20,000 sesterces per guard. That was roughly 8 years' salary for a regular soldier. The Praetorian Guards nodded approvingly. But Julianus had come prepared to spend 25,000 sesterces, he shouted from outside the walls. 10 years' wages for each man. Sulpicianus tried to counter, but he couldn't match that offer. 25,000 sesterces per guard meant the total price was around 200 million sesterces. That's roughly 50 million denarii. More money than most people could even imagine. But Julianus had another card to play. He reminded the guards that Sulpicianus was Pertinax's father-in-law. If you make him emperor, he warned them, he'll want revenge for his son-in-law's murder. He'll have you all executed. The guards realized he was right. They'd just killed Pertinax. His family would want blood. But this Julianus fellow, he had no personal connection to the dead emperor. He'd be grateful to them. He'd owe them everything. The calculation was cold, practical, evil. The guards opened the gates. They declared Didius Julianus the winner. They proclaimed him Emperor of Rome for 25,000 sesterces per man. The Praetorian Guard had sold the greatest empire in human history. They'd turned the throne of Caesar into a commodity. They'd reduced the heir of Augustus to the highest bidder. Julianus was escorted through the streets of Rome by the very soldiers who'd murdered his predecessor. He wore the purple robes of imperial power. He carried the symbols of absolute authority. But everyone who saw him knew the truth. He hadn't earned the throne. He'd bought it. The Roman people were disgusted. When Julianus appeared in public, they pelted him with stones. They shouted murderer and robber. They called him a pretender and a usurper. But Julianus didn't care. He had what he wanted. He was Emperor of Rome. And he'd gotten there not through military conquest or political skill, but through simple mathematics. He'd outbid his competition. What he didn't realize was that mathematics work both ways. If you can buy power, that means someone else can buy it too. And there were other men in the empire with money. Lots of money. Men who commanded real armies, not just palace guards. Men who were about to remind Didius Julianus that some things in life cannot be purchased. Because 400 miles north of Rome, a general named Septimius Severus was receiving word of the auction. And he was not amused. Didius Julianus was now Emperor of Rome. The problem? Nobody wanted him to be. The news of the auction spread across the empire like wildfire, and everywhere it went, it was met with horror and rage. Roman citizens couldn't believe their emperor had been sold like a piece of property. Provincial governors were appalled that the throne could be bought instead of earned. Military commanders were furious that palace guards thought they could choose the ruler of the known world. But 3 men were especially angry. 3 men who commanded real armies. 3 men who had the power to do something about it. In Syria, Governor Pescennius Niger declared himself emperor. He controlled 4 legions and had the support of the wealthy eastern provinces. He was the people's choice, the man Roman citizens were chanting for in the streets. In Britain, Governor Clodius Albinus also declared himself emperor. He commanded 3 legions of battle-hardened troops who'd spent years fighting Celtic tribes. He was young, ambitious, and had nothing to lose. But the most dangerous threat came from Pannonia, on the Danube frontier. Governor Septimius Severus commanded 16 legions, the entire Rhine-Danube army, and unlike the other pretenders, Severus was close to Rome. Very close. When Severus heard about the auction, his reaction was swift and decisive. He declared himself the avenger of Pertinax. He promised to punish the Praetorian Guards who'd murdered the rightful emperor, and he began marching his army toward Italy. Julianus, meanwhile, was discovering that buying the throne was easier than actually ruling from it. The Senate hated him. They saw him as a criminal who'd profited from murder. They refused to cooperate with his policies. They treated him like a usurper, not a legitimate emperor. The people hated him even more. Riots broke out across the city. Crowds would gather outside the palace, chanting the names of his rivals. When Julianus tried to address them, they threw stones and refused. Even the Praetorian Guards who'd sold him the throne were having second thoughts. They'd been promised their money, but the imperial treasury was nearly empty. There wasn't enough cash to pay them what they'd been guaranteed. Desperate to raise funds, Julianus began selling off imperial property. He debased the currency, reducing the silver content of Roman coins. He imposed new taxes on an already struggling population. Every decision made him more unpopular. But his biggest problem was military. Julianus commanded no real armies. The Praetorian Guard numbered only about 8,000 men. They were well equipped and well trained, but they were palace soldiers. They'd never fought a real battle against seasoned legions. Severus, by contrast, commanded 80,000 veteran troops who'd spent years fighting Germanic tribes. These were hard men who'd earned their positions through blood and conquest. They'd followed Severus across frozen rivers and through burning forests. They were loyal to him personally. As Severus marched closer to Rome, Julianus made increasingly desperate moves. He sent agents to try to assassinate his rival. They either failed or switched sides. He tried to bribe Severus's soldiers. They took the money and remained loyal to their general. He offered to share the empire, to rule jointly with Severus like co-emperors. Severus didn't even bother to reply. Finally, in a move that showed just how delusional he'd become, Julianus had the Praetorian prefect, Latus, executed, the same man who'd orchestrated Pertinax's murder and arranged the auction. Julianus thought this would prove his good intentions to the approaching army. It didn't work, because Severus wasn't interested in Julianus's intentions. He was interested in justice. By May of 193 AD, Severus's army was just 60 miles from Rome. Italian cities were opening their gates to welcome him. Local magistrates were switching sides. Even some of the Praetorian Guards were beginning to desert. Julianus had been emperor for 66 days, but his time was running out, because he'd made the same mistake that tyrants always make. He'd confused buying power with earning respect, and Rome was about to teach him the difference. On June 2nd, 193 AD, Didius Julianus learned the final lesson about power. Some things cannot be purchased. Septimius Severus was at the gates of Rome. His army stretched across the horizon, a sea of shields and spears that represented the true power of the empire. Not palace intrigue or political corruption, but military might earned through victory and loyalty. Inside the city, Julianus's support had completely collapsed. The Senate, sensing the inevitable outcome, held an emergency meeting. They formally condemned Julianus to death. They declared Severus the rightful emperor. They awarded divine honors to the murdered Pertinax. The Praetorian Guards who'd created this whole mess made one last desperate play. They approached Severus's representatives with an offer. They would arrest the murderers of Pertinax and hand them over for punishment. In exchange, they wanted pardons for the rest of the guards. Severus agreed. It was a clever move that split his enemies and avoided a costly siege. The remaining Praetorians immediately turned on their former comrades. They seized the soldiers who'd actually stabbed Pertinax. They dragged them before the Senate. They confessed their own roles in the conspiracy, hoping for mercy. With his own guards abandoning him, Julianus was left alone in the imperial palace. Only one Praetorian prefect and his own son-in-law remained loyal. Everyone else had fled or switched sides. A single soldier was sent to finish the job. He found Julianus in his private quarters, probably trying to figure out how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. The emperor who'd bought his throne with gold died alone, killed by the same system of violence and betrayal that had brought him to power. His last words, according to the historian Cassius Dio, were heartbreaking in their naivety. But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed? The man who'd profited from murder couldn't understand why he was being punished for it. The politician who'd bought his way to the top couldn't comprehend that money wasn't enough. The senator who'd reduced the empire to a commodity couldn't grasp that some things are sacred. Julianus had ruled for exactly 66 days. His body was given to his wife and daughter, who buried him quietly in his family tomb. There were no state honors, no public ceremonies, no mourning period. He'd bought the greatest office in human history and died forgotten. Meanwhile, Septimius Severus entered Rome without resistance. The first thing he did was disband the Praetorian Guard entirely. He stripped them of their ceremonial armor and forbade them from coming within 100 miles of the city on pain of death. Then he created a new guard recruited from his own loyal legions, men who'd earned their positions through merit, not money. Soldiers who understood that loyalty cannot be purchased, it must be earned. But the damage was done. The auction of 193 AD had shattered something fundamental about Roman authority. If the throne could be bought and sold like merchandise, what did that say about the empire itself? If money mattered more than merit, why should anyone respect Roman power? The year of the 5 emperors had begun. Civil wars would rage across the empire for the next 4 years. Hundreds of thousands would die in conflicts that started with one man's belief that everything has a price. Didius Julianus had wanted to buy his way to greatness. Instead, he'd sold the empire's soul. The story of Didius Julianus is more than just ancient history. It's a warning that echoes across the centuries. Every civilization faces the same fundamental question. What determines power? Is it money? Is it birth? Is it military strength? Or is it something deeper? Respect, legitimacy, the consent of the governed. Rome, in 193 AD, discovered what happens when money becomes the only currency that matters. When wealth can buy anything, including the highest office in the land. When corruption becomes so normalized that selling an empire seems like just another business transaction. The results were catastrophic, not just for Didius Julianus, who lost his life, not just for the Praetorian Guard, who lost their honor, but for the entire Roman Empire, which lost something it could never get back. The belief that its rulers were legitimate. After 193 AD, every Roman emperor would face the same question that haunted Julianus. Did he deserve the throne, or had he simply been better at acquiring it than his competitors? Some emperors, like Severus, managed to restore stability through military victory and administrative skill. Others succumbed to the same temptations that destroyed Julianus, believing that money and violence were enough to sustain power. But the empire never fully recovered from the lesson of that auction. The idea that Rome's greatest office could be bought and sold poisoned the well of Roman authority for centuries to come. Today, we face similar questions about power and legitimacy, about the role of money in politics, about whether wealth should determine influence, about the difference between earning authority and simply acquiring it. The Roman Empire whispers to us across the centuries with a simple warning. Some things are too sacred to sell. Some positions are too important to auction. Some forms of power cannot be purchased at any price. Because when you can buy the throne instead of earning it, you don't become a true emperor. You just become the highest bidder in a rigged game, and history remembers the difference. Didius Julianus learned this lesson too late. Let's hope we learn it in time.